2, 1.
Welcome everyone to the Free Our Future Summit and our second event of the day. Today we are going to have a panel about the state of student debt in America post-election. We're so honored to have all of you here. And we're very honored to have our special guest, Representative Katie Porter. I just want to say a few remarks quickly that, it's November 19th. We finally got through the election. I want to thank everyone on this call that worked so hard to ensure a Biden win. And we have a lot of work to do in this space because finally we have representatives like Representative Porter and so many others on Capitol Hill and in our states that are listening to us and believing that there is in fact a student debt crisis. So with that, we are so honored to have Representative Porter. In Washington, Congresswoman Porter has remained committed to putting Orange County families first. As a member of the House Financial Services Committee and House Oversight Reform Committee, she has asked the tough questions of bank CEOs and administration officials to hold them accountable for the American people. And if you haven't seen her grill the banking executives, you're missing out. And she's also been a key supporter of legislation to reduce the influence of dark money and politics to restore ethics in Washington. As a single working mom, Rep. Porter knows firsthand about the challenges faced by working families. She introduced bipartisan legislation to allow families to set aside more pre-tax income for dependent care. She continued to press for repeals of the limits on SALT, which is state and local tax deduction, which has hit California particularly hard, especially with middle-class families. And before coming to Congress, Congresswoman Porter spent nearly 2 decades taking on the special interests that dominate American politics and which drown out the voices of working families. As a California's independent watchdog against the bank, she made sure that the big banks that had cheated Orange County homeowners followed through on their promise to help affected families get back on their feet. As a consumer finance expert, Congresswoman Porter also helped Congress pass the original Credit Card Act in 2009. We are so honored to have Representative Porter here today with us. Do we have you on the line, Representative Katie Porter?
Yes, thank you so much, Natalia, for the introduction. This is Congresswoman Katie Porter, representing California's 45th Congressional District, and I am so delighted to be here today to discuss the many challenges facing student borrowers. And I'm honored to be opening up today's panel discussion on the current landscape of federal student loan debt policy. And I look forward to the rest of the summit on this very important topic. When I got to Congress, I founded the College Affordability Caucus. And my aim in doing so was twofold: to identify ways to tackle the student debt crisis, but also to bring down the cost of higher education for the future so that we don't create yet another generation of student loan debt borrowers. And as the leader of this caucus and a former professor at the University of California, Irvine, and for decades working as a consumer advocate, I am really committed to doing the work of holding predatory lenders, private colleges, and the Trump administration accountable. When the Department of Education under Secretary Betsy DeVos denied 99% of public service loan forgiveness applications, I led my colleagues in demanding answers. When Secretary DeVos threatened to withhold financial aid from 80,000 students in California, I led a group of my California colleagues in pushing back on that politically motivated stunt. Following that oversight, Betsy DeVos backed down, ensuring that those students received the financial assistance that they were promised. But there is still a lot of work ahead for us to do. The truth of the matter is this: student borrowers in California and across the country are hurting, regardless of what kind of loan they have. Today, 45 million people owe nearly $1.7 trillion in student loan debt. And that has more than doubled in the past decade. And since 2010, student loan debt has become the second largest category of consumer debt after home mortgages. If higher education can be understood as an investment intended to allow students to earn higher incomes after they graduate and throughout the rest of their careers, then we as a nation are not doing enough to make that investment come to fruition. And of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has only exacerbated the existing student debt crisis. In June, I introduced bipartisan legislation with my colleagues providing student borrower relief for Perkins loan holders, allowing the nearly 2 million borrowers with Perkins loans to forego making payments until October. And I was happy to see that both parties in Congress agreed that suspending student loan payments and interest accumulation was the right thing to do in this crisis. But of course, this crisis continues and the need for ongoing relief is real. The CARES Act provided relief for over 35 million Americans burdened with student debt. 10 million Americans continue, though, to struggle with making student debt payments due to the pandemic. We need to continue and expand our work to help provide relief to all Americans, including those with student loan debt. Higher education is a path to a better life, but not if you emerge from it in unsurmountable and crushing debt burden. And that's why I co-sponsored the COVID-19 Graduate Relief Act, which would allow 2020 college graduates to defer payments on their student loans for up to 3 years. And that would let these students focus on their health and safety during this coronavirus crisis. Right now, currently, the payments, interest, and collection process of all government-held student loans all government-held federal student loans is suspended through December 31st of this year. But that date is coming quickly. My Democratic colleagues and I have been pushing for a further extension and an expansion of this relief. The House passed a $3.4 trillion bill called the HEROES Act in May, which would have extended the student loan relief by a full year to September 30th, 2021. And the bill would expand also the coverage of the student loan assistance to commercially issued FFEL program, federal student loans and Perkins loans. It also included $10,000 in federal and private student loan forgiveness for borrowers who are experiencing economic hardship during the crisis. But as we all know, Senate Republicans have continually rejected the HEROES Act. And what that means is that millions of student loan borrowers will start getting billed again for their student loans come January 1, even as this pandemic rages on. I'm really encouraged that President-elect Biden and Vice President-elect Harris have taken a stance on the student debt crisis. And I look forward to working with the next administration on extending the moratorium on federal student loan payments. There is also a great and continuing need for better oversight and better accountability for student loan servicers. And as someone who worked during the foreclosure crisis to help deal with homeowners and saw how those mortgage servicers were failing to provide correct and accurate information to borrowers about the options, I am seeing this exact same thing play out in the student loan debt crisis. It's not enough to just address the pandemic-related concerns about making student loan payments. We also need to have a serious discussion about canceling student debt. Senator Elizabeth Warren's calls for a $50,000 across-the-board cancellation of federal student loan debt would help millions of American families. Student loan debt is a multi-generational crisis. And while I am so grateful for work of groups like the Young Invincibles and other young people and recent graduates leading this fight, we need to make clear that every American would benefit from student loan debt forgiveness because of the effect it would have on our economy and on economic mobility for generations to come. So parents and grandparents who have borrowed to help their children, as well as student loan borrowers, graduates themselves, need this help. According to the Center for American Progress, loan forgiveness of just $10,000 would eliminate all student loan debt for 16.3 million borrowers. That's more than 1/3 of all borrowers who could see their student loan debt eliminated with just $10,000 in forgiveness. And that same $10,000 in forgiveness would reduce the loan balances by half for another 9.3 million people. The time to act is now. And I'm going to continue to work with my colleagues and the Biden-Harris administration and advocates like those sponsoring this event to tackle this very important issue. I want to extend my gratitude to Next Gen Policy for inviting me, and I look forward to the rest of the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Congresswoman Porter. And I'm just so happy that you mentioned the January 1 cliff that borrowers are facing and the work we have to do, and also just showing how far we've moved and how fast to talking and about really canceling student debt this time. So it's really exciting to hear that from you, and we're so honored that you were able to join us. And with that, I think we'll get started with our wonderful panelists that we have today. I'm very honored. I don't know if I introduced myself at first. I'm Natalia Abrams. I'm the director at Student Debt Crisis. We are an organization that is trying to change the way we pay for education in America and focus on advocacy and education. And we've had the pleasure to work with all of the wonderful women on this panel for years. And joining us first off is Persis Yu. Persis is a staff attorney at the National Consumer Law Center, NCLC, and is the director of NCLC's Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project. Persis, do we have you on the line?
Yes, I am here. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Persis Yu. As Natalia said, I am the director of the Student Loan Borrower Assistance Project at the National Consumer Law Center. We are an organization that represents low-income consumers, both in policy matters on the Hill and like, but also we actually do some direct representation with student loan borrowers, and we run a network of legal aid attorneys across the country and work to try to, get the voices of low-income student loan borrowers up to policymakers on the Hill and in the administration.
Phenomenal, Persis. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're also joined today by Bonnie Littrell. I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. If not, I apologize. Bonnie is the Director of Research and Advocacy at the Student Borrower Protection Center. Bonnie, do we have you here?
Yes, and yes, you did pronounce it correctly. Thank you. Hi, everyone, and thanks so much. I just want to say thanks for having me today, and a huge thank you to Cami Pierre and Sam Sen for their efforts to pull this whole event together. We're all hugely appreciative of your work. As Natalia mentioned, my name is Bonnie Littrell, and I work at the Student Borrower Protection Center, which is a nonprofit organization dedicated to expanding consumer protections and, like most of the people on this panel, ending the student debt crisis. Prior to joining the SBPC, I served in the Office for Students and Young Consumers at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where I worked for the former student loan ombudsman and spent a lot of time focusing on the breakdowns in the student loan servicing system and seeing how that was affecting consumers' lives through consumer complaints. And when the Consumer Bureau stopped working on behalf of consumers, we all left and started this nonprofit. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And thanks for starting the nonprofit and continuing the mission, even though the location changed. Very much appreciate it. And last but certainly not least, we have Charlotte Hancock. Charlotte is the Director of Communications and Digital Strategy for Generation Progress, and also has done a lot of work on the Generation Progress's Higher Ed Not Debt campaign. Charlotte, do we have you on?
Yeah, hi. I'm so excited to be here with this powerful panel of boss badass ladies. I don't know what level of cursing we're doing on this. But yes, thank you for the nice introduction, Natalia. My name's Charlotte Hancock. I work at Generation Progress. Generation Progress is a national advocacy advocacy first, but policy advocacy organization that works on issues that matter to 18 to 35-year-olds. Obviously, one of the most important ones, and one of the ones that we're seeing the most traction on at the moment, college affordability and student loan debt. Generation Progress also houses the Higher Ed Not Debt campaign, which I've been a part of for the past 6 years. And we've loved working through the Higher Ed Not Debt campaign with all the folks who are hosting this awesome series of events over the course of the couple of days here, as well as these great panelists here as well. So thank you so much, Natalia.
Yes, thank you, Charlotte. And, again, we are so grateful to Next Gen Policy here in California for hosting this wonderful event and bringing us all together. And I agree with you, Charlotte. This is definitely a rockin' panel. So thank you. So with that, let's get started. We have a new administration, which is so exciting. And what should student loan borrowers expect to see on the horizon? What's coming, in 2021? I think just quickly before we get into that, if you can give us an overview of what's been going on this year and what is the state of student loan borrowers in America?
Yeah, absolutely. So, since March, when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared a national emergency, there's been a lot happening. And so the negotiations have largely been around a stimulus package. We saw a couple of them actually happen in March. And they did a lot of things, but importantly for student loan borrowers, the CARES Act, which was passed in late March, provided a lot of important protections for borrowers. That's the legislation that gave us a payment suspension. It's stopped interest accrual on student loan borrowers. It allowed time to count towards income during payment forgiveness and public service loan forgiveness. And it also suspended collection on defaulted loans. But very importantly, it only did that for a subset of borrowers, as Representative Porter mentioned. It only did that for borrowers who had department-held loans, and that unfortunately left out a whole lot of borrowers. And it only did so until the end of September. So since then, I think we've been tirelessly working on an additional stimulus package, basically since April. And a lot of the negotiations have been, about extending the payment suspension, both in terms of the duration of it and in terms of who is covered. There's been a lot of movement about trying to get the commercially held FFEL borrowers and the Perkins borrowers covered. But importantly, the other pieces of the conversation, which we'll go into more depth about, is of course about loan cancellation and making sure that we're not just kicking this can down the road and that we're providing real relief that will provide a real stimulus benefit to student loan borrowers. So there's a myriad of other very technical things that we're also hoping for that will, make things go better, not just, not in the immediate, but in the let's really get this right so that when things do get better, people aren't in the same financial straits. But we can talk more in detail about those as we go through them.
Yeah, thank you, Persis. And I think, you mentioned this payment pause, and Congresswoman Porter brought up this January 1st, deadline or cliff. Bonnie, even if we get debt cancellation, which I think I can safely say all the groups here are fighting for, what do borrowers need to know about this January 1st repayment when payments resume?
Yeah, so as Representative Porter mentioned in her remarks, in January, tens of millions of borrowers are going to have their payments turned back on, despite the fact that most are not in a meaningfully better economic situation than they were when the CARES Act originally passed. Many of them are in a worse situation now. 12 million people are slated to lose their unemployment benefits the day after Christmas. Another 4.5 million have already exhausted their unemployment benefits. And we can talk about how these borrowers are eligible for things like income-driven repayment. But the fact of the matter is, operationally, it was a disaster when student loan servicers tried to implement the CARES Act, and it will absolutely be a disaster as they try to remove these protections. And so, as any student loan borrower can attest, just because the law says you have the right to something doesn't mean your student loan company is going to make sure you get that right. But I think the best indicator of the chaos and the borrower harm that will undoubtedly ensue can be seen from the 9 million borrowers that Persis mentioned who were left out of the CARES Act. Borrowers with older types of federal student loans that are owned by banks did not receive relief, neither did private student loan borrowers. And while some of these lenders offered temporary forbearances at the beginning of the pandemic, that largely expired back in August. So what we're seeing now is surges in hardship forbearance where it's available and delinquency where it's not. And so when this trend carries over to the broader federal student loan market, so on top of all of the normal stuff that comes with the fallout from delinquent and defaulted debt, we're going to see delinquent and defaulted federal student loans, which can jeopardize a borrower's ability to get jobs, to qualify for apartments, and ultimately meaningfully recover from this recession. So what does this all mean for January? There's no indication that Betsy DeVos intends to extend the payment suspension before inauguration. And so I think that means that action is absolutely needed on day one. It's absolutely critical for student loan borrowers. Millions of borrowers are going to have their bills come due and they still need help.
Yes, absolutely, Bonnie. And I think that's why, as much as, and we're going to launch into it right now about talking about the fight to cancel student debt, but we just want to stress to all borrowers until that we see changes, and we will make sure to notify you in Congress of any extension. We all need to operate on the, as if we are paying back January 1st and make the plans for that, which is so difficult during the holidays. And I think kind of all this jumbled mess, so to speak, leads us to, why we probably should be canceling some student debt. So Persis, do you want to just kind of kick us off? And I'd love to hear from all of you on, how you, what you feel in terms of student debt cancellation and, whether, are we there yet? Representative Porter says now is the time. Tell us why.
Yeah,
Persis?
absolutely. Hi there. I think that there's a lot of really exciting movement that's been going on in the debt cancellation space. I mean, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, right, like a payment suspension, while I think incredibly critical right now, is not enough. We need borrowers to be able to not just, make it through the next month, but to really be able to recover when this crisis is over. Like I mentioned before, we represent low-income borrowers. They are overwhelmingly borrowers of color. And we know that in the student loan system, borrowers of color are disproportionately hit by student loan debt. They both owe more money, they are more likely to be in default, and borrowers who are in good standing also take longer to pay back their loans. So there's both a pandemic crisis happening right now, and there's a racial equity crisis happening on our in the student loan system. And then unfortunately for these borrowers, these things are happening simultaneously because we know that the impact of the pandemic is also disproportionately impacting communities of color. So this is what's kind of led to this push for student loan cancellation right now. There's been a lot of really exciting energy. It's not a new idea. Senator Sanders introduced legislation to do this a number of years ago, as did Senator Warren. But we have seen, the drumbeat really pick up right now, and because we see how much student loan debt is a drag on the economy. We saw it included in the HEROES Act in a limited form. It has been included in the National Defense Authorization Act legislation. Representatives Presley and Omar introduced a bill for $30,000 of student loan cancellation. And most recently, Senators Warren and Schumer introduced a resolution calling for the president, for the administration to cancel the debt. What a lot of exciting legal analysis has discovered is that this does not need an act of Congress to happen, that this is something that the administration can do, and they can do it on day one. And so there's a lot of groups pushing to make that a priority for President-elect Biden.
That's so exciting, Persis. And, along with cancellation, Charlotte, I know that Generation Progress has worked with us on this. What can we do beyond this? This is the Free My Future Summit. So we also have a lot of students that are joining us. What is on the horizon, both in terms of cancellation, but for current students as well?
Yeah, I think as Persis said, it was exciting to see so much pop up on student debt cancellation, both on the Hill and in the Biden-Harris campaign this year. But as I think everybody who is on this panel knows, and I think folks who are tuning in are probably aware, this is not the only thing I think that we're fighting for in coalition. It's a really big question, unfortunately. We have been fighting for the big thing, cancellation for what feels like so long, but none of us can afford to leave behind the folks who aren't helped by the cancellation proposal. And so any solutions to for federal student loan borrowers can't just stand by themselves. And so I think we're all here trying to remember like who else we need to think about getting solutions for. And I think that's private student loan borrowers, right? We're talking a lot about federal student loan debt cancellation, but I know it's a big question that we're constantly trying to figure out, like what's next? How do we help private student loan borrowers? We also want to think about helping current and future college attendees, right? We can't just cancel student loan debt and do nothing to address the cost of college for current and future students, or we'll be right back where we started, I think, as Persis said earlier here, with a new student debt crisis exploding for future generations. We also have a bunch of sections of the population and spaces here that need particular attention. Right now, we have a gigantic funding shortfall for our community colleges. Our community colleges are severely underfunded. We also have a funding shortfall for our HBCUs, also public colleges and universities, because generally what happens when we have an economic downturn in this country, like we're seeing right now, is that state and federal funding for colleges, for post-secondary education gets cut out of the budget first. That's how we got into this situation with the student debt crisis to begin with. And I think we're probably going to see stuff like that happen again unless we're really, really careful here. So we need to make sure that we're funding our public education. So I think luckily Biden said he does want to make community college and 2-year and 4-year public colleges tuition free for students making less than $125,000. So he has plans. He ran on a platform. He's thinking about these things. He's thinking about fixing our public service loan forgiveness program. You know, these things are all sort of on his mind. I think it's great that he is married to somebody who is a community college professor. Dr. Biden is probably making sure that he remembers all of these things as well. So love that. Thank you, Dr. Biden. And then I also don't want to leave out undocumented students here. I know that our undocumented students often have forgotten student loan burdens because they're sort of not counted in the way that we regularly count student loan debt. They're trying to pay for college on credit cards and a number of other things because they don't have access fairly regularly to the student loans that the general population has access to. And finally, and though I know, I'm sorry, I could keep going here, we also need to make sure that the corporations who are skimming a profit out of this system, this is such like a twisted and confusing system and fairly unregulated because it's such a new system compared to so many other financial systems in this country, that we have profiteers who are trying to make a buck off of Americans, off of taxpayers, off of students here. And we need to make sure that borrowers and taxpayers are protected from waste, fraud, abuse. And so that's addressing predatory and for-profit college scams, that's reining in abusive student loan servicers. And those are, you know, the companies that you pay your student loans through, like Navient and Nelnet, make sure that they're not abusing student loan borrowers, and just generally ensuring that college works much more like a public good than something to be profited off of. So I am really glad that we are so close to one of the biggest fights that we've been fighting for so long. But also we have other things that, you know, we all are sort of like, our work is not done, unfortunately. Yeah, so thank you for the question, Natalia.
No, and thank you for all of your work, for coordinating with all of us to make sure that we are fighting on all fronts. This is a very diverse, you know, multi-issue space that we all exist in. And so we're trying to constantly work on, you know, different policy aspects, making sure borrowers know about what they need to know, fighting for, as you said, future, current, and student loan borrowers. So we want to make sure they actually don't have to be student loan borrowers. And you're absolutely right that we have to address both sides of the coin if we're really going to solve this overall crisis.
Yeah, I think we got, like, I love the thought of just like not dividing up current borrowers and future borrowers, because that's such a powerful constituency when you put those folks together. And I think when they're kind of fighting for each other, because it's like, I don't want other people to go through what I went through, you know? So I love that student debt crisis really leads in that space.
Thank you. And, you know, and also we need to include, as Congresswoman Porter said, those that, you know, have paid off their student debt, those that haven't had student debt, because this benefits all of us and it benefits the overall economy. Bonnie, I'd love to give you a chance to talk a bit about the work your organization's doing to cancel student debt and for student loan borrower, or all Americans on this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we are beyond excited about the enthusiasm and buy-in that this movement has gained in just even the last year. And I am really honored to be on this panel because all of you are very much leading in that space. I think a particular note to us is after the election, it's really important that any action we take can be done through executive action. And I think everyone's kind of talked about this in their opening remarks, but we are really excited to help bolster the legal arguments there and show and lay the groundwork, lay the roadmap to show that there is a way to do this through executive action and that you can target the populations of borrowers that Congress has already, with bipartisan support, said these borrowers need relief. Borrowers with total and permanent disabilities, service members with student debt, borrowers with low income over a long period of time who rely on income-driven repayment. All of these borrowers, Congress said, deserve a way out and deserve a lifeline. And the administration and the next Secretary of Education will have the authority to take action there. And then I would also just add, there's been a lot of discussion on Twitter mostly about the tax liabilities here. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a way to do this without tax implications for borrowers.
This is all just so exciting. So this isn't going to cost taxpayers money in the way we typically think. This can be done on day one by Joe Biden, right, with the sign of a pen. Okay, so how do we do it? How do we blend all this great policy and advocacy work that you're doing? And Persis, if you can start us off on that, but I'd love to hear from all of you on how we're going to take this over the finish line.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things that's most important is that our policymakers need to hear from borrowers. Just yesterday, there was an amazing effort coordinated by largely the groups on this panel, but and many others as well. I give a shout out to Americans for Financial Reform for doing a lot of the legwork on that. But there was an incredible letter signed by almost 240 groups, civil rights groups, unions, consumer groups, student groups. And I think that that's really important. We need to hear how impactful this will be for folks. I know for the borrowers that we represent, having debt cancellation would be huge, right? Our folks they're losing out on vital assets because of the way that our student loan system works, right? Borrowers in default lose their total tax refunds, including earned income tax credits, child tax credits. It threatens their housing. It threatens their ability to get medical care for their kids. We hear these stories, and as much as I want people to keep reaching out to me and telling me these stories, I really want people to reach out to their policymakers and let them know. There's, Natalia, give you a shout out to your MoveOn.org petition, because I think that this is what's really important, is that people need to know that this would be important. And what would it mean, right? Like, what would it mean to live in a world where you don't have student loan debt? For me personally, it's been hugely revelatory, these past few months to have that payment suspension. And imagine what people could do with their finances if this was, the way the world was.
Yeah. Absolutely. I've been saying to a lot of folks, I think why we've moved so far with cancellation is because borrowers actually know what it feels like to have their debt canceled right now. We're feeling what it would be like to not have to pay student loan debt, especially during a hard time. But as Congresswoman Porter mentioned, it's not just the pandemic times. As everyone on this call knows, we've been in a student debt crisis for quite some time. Charlotte, I'd love, you've been doing coalition work for, oh my gosh, 5-7 years now. I actually did for a long, long time. Can you talk about the importance of, national coalition building and how that's kind of brought us to here, but again, what we can do to take this over the finish line?
Oh, yeah. I mean, for sure. I think it's just thinking about the debt cancellation as a specific example here. It's amazing to see how quickly the Overton window shifted on this. And I do think that that really just speaks to, when the country got slammed by the pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis, I think what we saw was just how that spoke to the scale of the problem and the fact that candidates, recognized canceling student debt was the right thing to do. Progressive populist ideas like fixing the student debt crisis are winning ideas. But that didn't just happen fully organically, that was the sort of thing that they were like, this is something that we can pick up. I think what's interesting is when I started working with the HEND campaign, I realized it is absolutely necessary to have this big tent when you're trying to make any changes on the scale of something like addressing $1.6 trillion in student loan debt, right? The Higher Ed Net Debt campaign was started, I think 7 years ago, with a huge mix of organizations from labor to think tanks to legal aid clinics to state-based nonprofits to civil rights organizations to advocacy organizations. Natalia, you at Student Debt Crisis were one of the founding members. And believe it or not, when the campaign started, it feels strange to say this on a panel today, right now. When the campaign started, there was no national narrative really on the student debt crisis. People knew they had it. They knew it was a problem, but it's not like candidates were running with plans to fix this. It's not like legislation was popping up to fix this on a regular basis. When stuff was popping up, it was really just nibbling around the edges. Policymakers didn't have coordinated talking points on what needed to get fixed, and advocates were working on awesome projects across the country, but without an easy way to share those resources and work smarter instead of harder, right? And so I think, having some national coalition and even state-based coalition tables like this has just been a godsend, a lifesaver, and sort of demonstrated for folks how wonderful it is to be able to exchange ideas and share resources. Our first campaign goal at Higher Ed Not Dead was just to get a mention, just a mention, right, Natalia, of student debt in a presidential debate. And we went from that to Bernie Sanders and Hillary Clinton to having platforms to address the student debt crisis when they were both running in 2016. And from that to Joe Biden saying that he has a plan to cancel student loan debt. That is a lot of progress on an issue area over the course of 7 years. So much progress. That's such a long way in such a few short years. And that's because we had so many different minds and people coming together and sort of swimming in the same direction, saying you're going to take that track, I'm going to take this track, you're going to talk about that amount of cancellation, I'm going to talk about this amount of cancellation. But we all had sort of an overarching shared goal, and that was to make sure that people were not suffering from having the burden of student debt or financial hardship and figuring out college education. So I think I'm so grateful that people in this space continue to be so generous and continue to sort of look at things as a greater good, as opposed to sort of nitpicking and battling over small details. I know we don't always agree, but I think that that's such a wonderful thing about the student debt advocacy space is that for the most part, we all just kind of are yeah, but we got eye on the prize. And I think that really shows in the results that we've achieved over just a few years here. So.
Yeah, well, I think everyone on this call should pat themselves on the back for where we getting to this point. And I think it's why for the folks listening that we might all seem so hopeful, even though this is a dire situation for so many, because we've seen how quickly this has moved. And we are, I'll promise for myself, and I think everyone on this call, we are not going to stop if we only get student debt cancellation for federal loan borrowers. And we know there's private loan borrowers. We know that there are students that are looking to go to college and figuring out how to pay for it. So, keep telling us, as Persis said, but also make sure to be telling your representatives about how you want to see change. You touched on it for a second, Charlotte, about state-based work. Bonnie, we've been doing some work in California. And I'd love for you to just touch on, kind of the state-based work going on and then how that works with the kind of national coalitions out there.
Yeah, Absolutely. I hear a lot of people say that the federal student loans or the student loan crisis broadly is a federal problem, and so let the federal government deal with it. And I think we can all agree that at best, that perspective is naive. And at worst, and as we've seen over the last 4 years, that perspective is dangerous. I think our collective guiding principle should be that basic consumer protections, the ones that are necessary to live a decent life in this country, are really too important to trust in any single person or any single level of government. And so we need a real meaningful backstop for when times are bad, and a powerful force to push the government even further when it's our ally in the office, right? So that's where states come in. I think for all the state groups watching right now, you all are on the front lines. You know the lived realities of borrowers, deciding between buying diapers or paying their student loan bill. You see how the student loan system further entrenches disparities in a rigged system. And the harder you fight for progressive solutions at the state level, the higher the bar is set at the federal level. For example, when literally nothing was happening to protect borrowers at the federal level, states stepped up to tackle establishing borrower bills of rights. It started with Connecticut way back in 2015. And each year, the bills got stronger and stronger, culminating in what Natalia just referenced, the California Borrower Bill of Rights. And now, creating a federal set of servicing standards is a real possibility under a new administration. And states, all the states listening, you all set the baseline for what we can expect that to look like. Teachers and veterans and borrowers with disabilities and more will all be protected because of state work and how hard the state advocates fought. And so for any state advocates that want to take on the student debt crisis in their state, please know, and I'm sure I speak for everyone on the panel now, you have support and allies at the national level for sure. Student loans sit in a weird place that raise a lot of questions around preemption with the Higher Education Act for federal student loans and the National Bank Act for private student loans. And quite honestly, the student loan industry pays a lot of lobbyists a lot of money with the sole task of going state by state and affirmatively lying about what is and is not preempted and what a state can do to protect its constituents. And we're all having those fights out daily, and we would love to help you avoid them. So please reach out.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And thank you to everyone watching. We're actually getting some really powerful comments on YouTube, and I'd love if we can just take a moment to address some of them. So, and this is, I know, something we've all worked on. Many borrowers are talking about the stigma and shame that is associated with student loan debt. Persis, can you speak to this? Is this something, I know you work with borrowers one-on-one very often. Is this an ongoing theme? I know we see it, but please, and why they should be ashamed.
I mean, absolutely. I think there is a huge stigma around student loan debt and any debt in general, right? The National Consumer Law Center represents consumers on a multitude of different levels, whether or not that's, medical debt, home foreclosure, debt collection in general. But I do think that this has been one of the barriers to getting real change, is that folks are afraid to admit that they're in debt, and especially if they're in trouble on their debt. I talk to folks in the media all the time who are looking to speak to borrowers, and borrowers are reluctant to come forward. I think that this is a thing that we need to tackle in kind of our social discourse in general, that we need to remove the stigma from debt, right? I mean, for a lot of people, taking on student loan debt isn't a choice, right? Like there's this framing in the ether that, people chose to go to college and they chose, to take on this debt. And so why should we help them when it was their irresponsible choice in the first place? And I think that doesn't match reality, right? We also live in a society that realistically, a college degree is necessary for, a large number of jobs that didn't need them in the past. And the reality is also that most people cannot afford to go to college without taking on debt. And, when we see what 44 million student loan borrowers have this is not something that people are alone in. And so I think in our national discourse, we do need to be more open about the fact that people have debt, that it's a real thing. And it's not a moral failing. It is, in fact, it is the only way in many instances that people can get an education to try to, provide for their families.
That's absolutely right. I believe there is as many student loan borrowers as there are uninsured healthcare, people that do not have healthcare, adults that don't have healthcare in America. So this is a very broad problem, and that's just directly who is impacted. And it's very hard to tell you, out there in the audience, not to feel ashamed when we have this culture of having debt shame us. But I think that the reason we bring up the number a lot is to show that you're not alone, and that this is, obviously all 45 million of us couldn't have got this so wrong. And, it's not your fault, and we're here to help you, and we're here to help get to a better situation legislatively so we don't have to go through this crisis again. And on that, I think I'd love to just know from each one of you, what actionable next steps can borrowers take, and students and everyone that wants to fight against the student debt crisis for our future. So Charlotte, if you'd like to start us off on actions that folks listening can take right now.
Sure. I think that, it is no coincidence that the people who overwhelmingly voted for Joe Biden are also the people who are disproportionately impacted by the student debt crisis, right? People of color, women, there is a direct correlation, and people voted for a candidate that they saw had a student debt plan and wanted to do something about their student loan debt. So I think our next step here, as people who voted potentially for progressive change, is to then hold those folks accountable. I think we all kind of realized that this was like the first step. And I think then the next thing here is making sure that actually happens. So I think we need to make sure that we're contacting folks on the Hill and paying attention to our elected officials. As Bonnie emphasized, that's not just our federally elected officials, that's also our state elected officials. They tend not to hear from folks as much, so we have to make sure that we're paying attention there too, because there are things we can do on the state level. It's our representatives and our senators, and it's also our president, because as we've talked about on this phone call, the executive branch can do a lot, the Department of Education can do a lot to make sure that student loan borrowers are helped and taken care of. And then I think we also just have to make sure that folks who may not have their student debt canceled are not left behind, and to continue to sort of keep this big tent going, and make sure that we're working for all student loan borrowers.
Absolutely. Thank you, Charlotte. Bonnie, what can folks do right now if they want to get involved?
Sure. I would add on to everything Charlotte said, and also emphasize that I think elected officials at every level need to hear your story. Definitely to the point you made earlier, please don't be ashamed that you have student debt. I do too, 45 million people do. You're not alone. And the more we talk about it, the more our elected leaders know that this is an issue impacting their constituents, the more they can take action. And we're seeing increasing action from cities as big as San Francisco and New York to Memphis and Niagara Falls, all at the city level, making sure that borrowers have protections and borrowers have access to the resources they need to manage their student debt. So I think the number one thing you can do is speak up.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bonnie. And Persis, same question. What can folks do right now to take action so we can actually see real relief on day one?
So I absolutely echo everything that Charlotte and Bonnie has said. I think one of the most dangerous things that folks can think right now is that because Biden was elected, that we don't need to worry anymore, and that things are going to be taken care of. And I think that we absolutely need to make sure to hold the next administration's feet to the fire. Even if he believes the right things, we need to make sure that he knows that it's a priority, right? And so I'd say, in addition to the other places that Charlotte and Bonnie have mentioned, I think folks need to write letters to their local newspapers, right? The editorial boards of your local media make big decisions about how this story is being told. So even if they don't publish your letter, I mean, hopefully they will, right? But even if they don't, the input that they get shapes the dialogue and how this is talked about. I think also in terms of, your own loans, right? Like folks, I hope folks will feel empowered to try to do things with their own loans. I think there's things that we should be doing to get prepared for this January 1st cliff that we're facing. And when things don't go right, borrowers need to know that they should be complaining. Thanks to a lot of the bills that Bonnie's organization has passed, a number of states have student loan ombudsmen that can be, that can be a resource for folks. Hopefully we will see a more active Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that will be looking at complaints. And we hear this a lot, that folks aren't complaining, or we only had this number of complaints, therefore there must not be problems. And I know that's not true. I think you all know that that's not true. And so we need to hold people accountable. And I think that starts with borrowers.
Absolutely. So,
If I
just
could,
to wrap up. Oh, go. Yes, Charlotte.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, if I could add just one more thing. I know that we're planning towards an inevitability on the January cliff, but I also know that folks on the Hill are still sort of having some discussions there. And I know that there's a lot going on, and I know that they have a ton of a whirlwind of priorities, but also I think we still have a chance at trying to get that cliff punted away from January 1st. So applying pressure to federal legislators, both your reps and your senators on that cliff. And, fingers crossed that it's, we don't have to deal with that, because that would be awesome. But let's plan towards it, but also let's try to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't happen. Sorry, Natalia.
No, that's a really great point. So I think if we're going to put this in order for folks listening, because we know it's a lot, first, we want to fight to make sure that borrowers have an extension on their payment. That's fighting to make sure the January cliff doesn't happen. Then we all want to fight to cancel student loan debt. While that might not be all student loan debt when all is said and done, we are going to continue to fight for more for private student loan borrowers, for those paying for college, for those looking to want to go to college. The ways that you all can take action is by, first and foremost, sharing your stories with your state lawmakers, your senators, your local and US representatives. I think Persis had a great idea, a great point, that we need to let the media know as well. Social media is a great way to also get the word out. Many of our elected officials don't get tweeted at a lot. And so, just let them know how you feel. And in fact, if everyone that's listening right now can use the hashtag cancel student debt and hashtag protect all borrowers, we can make some noise on Twitter as we speak. So I'm very honored to have this wonderful rockin' panel of women with Charlotte Hancock, Persis Yu, and Bonnie Luttrell, and also our very special guest, Congresswoman Katie Porter. Next, we'd love for you to join us on Twitter. You're hopefully already there using the hashtag cancel student debt, and you can join us with that, or hashtag protect borrowers, and tweet us questions. If you have questions on student debt policy or regarding your own student debt crisis, we'll be standing by on our Twitter account to answer questions, along with a lot of the groups that are participating in this wonderful Free Our Future Summit that Next Gen Policy has been hosting. So we just want to thank you all so much for being here. Check out all of the events on the Free My Future, check out all the events for Free My Future on their website at nextgenpolicy.org/freemyfuture. And with that, we want to just thank everyone. Please enjoy your lunch, tweet at us, ask us questions, and come back for more great discussions today and tomorrow on student loan debt and how we end the student debt crisis. Thank you, everyone, so much.
All right.